I'm Greg Greenwood and welcome to my studio. This video is part 2 of our 2-part series on bezels and cabochon stone setting. In part 1, we learned the first 3 steps of successful cabochon stone setting. Step 1 was identifying different cuts of cabochon stones. Step 2 was accurate measurements of the bezel wire using math and no math techniques. Step 3 was accurate cutting of the bezel wire in preparation for soldering using different types of cutting tools. In this video, we're going to learn the next steps in setting cabochon stones. Step 4 is soldering with the minimum amount of solder. Now we're ready to solder the bezel wire together. I'm using hard solder, and I've placed the pallium down on the soldering pad and put the bezel wire on top of it, fluxed it, and this way the solder will flow right up into the solder seam and we'll be all set. So we'll heat it up evenly. Heat both sides of that solder seam evenly, and the solder will melt up right into the seam and we'll have a perfect solder shot. There we go. Once you finish soldering the bezel wire together, check on the inside to make sure there's no excess solder there. If there is any excess, go ahead and take a small needle file it on down, take your round emery stick and work that down, make it nice and smooth. That will make sure that your stone does fit properly. Don't worry about any excess on the outside. Then slide it onto a mandrel, check to see if it's nice and even all the way around. If there are any bulges or gaps, go ahead and give it a tap with your rawhide mallet and that will true it out. Then we'll be ready to slide it on the stone and fit it to the stone. Step 5 is getting an accurate fit. Now that we have our bezel wire off the mandrel and it's nice and round and has all the kinks out of it, we want to make it more oval. So you can simply just take it and squeeze it in your fingers, and this will start making it more oval. And then we can slip it onto our stone and just take and start pinching it until it fits the stone perfectly, because the edges are nice and smooth, and so you just need to pinch it a little bit to make it that oval, and it will fit really well. What you want to do is make sure that that stone will go in from the top with no resistance, but we don't want it sloppy. We want it to fit nice, but we did good measurements, so I think we're going to be in good shape. So let's just take this, and we want to be able to have it drop down into the stone without any pushing on it. If by chance it is a little bit small, when you do put it on the mandrel, you can tap it with the rawhide mallet and push it down on the mandrel. This will expand it a little bit, and then you can fit it perfectly. This is the stage that we must make sure that it fits perfectly. You cannot solder it to the base plate and then expect to bend the bezel wire. It will not work. We want to make sure that we get a good fit on the bezel to the base plate. To do this, simply put your bezel wire onto some emery and start rubbing it around in a circle. This will wear the bottom of the bezel down nice and smooth and even. Then it's always a good idea after you've done that to make sure that you double check it and make sure that it'll plop in with no resistance. There are many ways that you can set up the bezel wire to solder onto the base plate. The biggest criteria is to make sure that you can get from underneath. We want the heat to come from underneath because that base plate has got so much more mass to it that we need to put more heat on it. So we want to come from underneath. You can use a tripod with a wire screen. The wire screens have a tendency to suck a little bit too much of the heat away, but I have used those many times. They do work well. You can use a trivet. You can bridge the gap with some soldering blocks, or you can use the third hands with cross-lock tweezers like I have set up here. You'll notice that I have them at the opposite corners. That will give me some stability when it's being heated. Plus also, I'm only touching real small parts of it, so it's not going to be a heat sink. So I'm going to be able to use most of my heat here to do the soldering job. Bring the torch from underneath and start heating the base plate. The excess flux will start burning off, getting rid of that extra water, and it will lay down very quickly. Then I'll place my pallions on the inside of the bezel. Finish putting in my solder, my pallions of solder. Make sure I'm warming it up. I like to make sure that the pallions touch both the back plate and the bezel wire. Just push them on over so they're touching both pieces of metal. I'm using medium solder here, and there it starts to melt. And it's flowing all the way around. Here's our bezel out of the pickle, and you can see it's nice and clean, good, solid solder joint all the way around the entire piece. I used the minimum amount of solder, used about 7 pallions of solder on this. So you can see it was very little amount. Some people like to take their pallions and ball them up and put them inside the bezel wire when you're soldering. I'll just use a little bit smaller ones. I don't seem to have any trouble with the residue that's left in there from the pallions. This is the time of reckoning right now. We're going to slip the stone inside here and make sure that it fits perfectly before we go any further. Now, there's word of caution here. Don't put your stone in the bezel right now without using this right here, dental floss. And I like to use the floss that is the tape. It's a lot thinner and works really well. But doesn't make any difference. Whatever kind that you got, you can lay your dental floss across there, and then you can take your stone and drop it in, and it should drop in with no extra pressure being put on it at all. And there we go. Now, how do you get it out of there? Simply take the dental floss, pull it, and it'll come right on out. Don't forget to put that in there. You do not want to get your stone stuck in there, because then you're going to have to make a mess out of your bezel. Dental floss pulls it right out. Or you can cut or drill holes in the back. Some designs that I've done, I've used a real decorative piercing on the inside, so the back of the stone will show also. It's kind of cool, and then you don't have to worry about using the dental floss. You stick your stone in there, you can always push it out from the back. Now that we know that our stone fits perfectly, we can cut the excess base plate off. We can do this a couple different ways. We can use shears and cut it off. A little word of caution here: if you use the shears, sometimes it'll bend the bezel wire out of position and kind of twist the metal a little bit. I just like to take a jeweler saw and cut it out. It's just as fast, it's nice and clean and neat, and that way you have more control over it. I sawed all the excess off the back piece and left a small edge along the outer perimeter of the stone, filed it down, used my emery sticks, made it nice and even, and then I textured it with a riveting hammer, just to add a little interest to that area. Then I decided to do a forged wire that I'll solder onto the back instead of just soldering on a plain old jump ring. I like to have something a little bit more decorative. So that will be soldered on about like this. Here's the back forged wire. I've liver sulfured the piece also, and then did a little buffing on it. And then now we're ready to set the stone. The tools that are normally used are a stone pusher or a prong pusher, has a flat end to it, a rocker tool, which this particular one I made myself out of brass because I like to use the brass instead of steel, and a burnisher for finishing it off. Step 6 is anchoring your project. We have to hold this stone in position. You can put it right on your bench and then start taking your tools and pushing on it. You could use a block of wood with some nails in it or pins in it and simply mount it right onto the wood, and then you can put it on a sandbag or directly onto your bench, and then you can spin it around and set the stone. You can use this product, which is called THERMO-LOC. It's a product that you warm up in hot water, a microwave, or I use a heat gun. Get it nice and pliable, make a little pad out of it, stick it down onto the piece of wood, stick your project into it, and then you're ready to set your stone. Here's another way to hold your piece. I've used a wooden post top and cut a groove into the area so you can put a ring shank down into the inside of it. And then I've used some of the THERMO-LOC on the top to hold the piece in position. And then this one you can use very similar to an engraving ball, putting it onto a sandbag, and then you can turn it in any direction that you want for setting your stone. Many jewelers will use an engraving ball or an engraving block to hold their piece in position when they're setting the stones, which is awesome. The only problem is they're super expensive, and for the beginning student it's kind of out of reach. This particular one is a real inexpensive alternative to the engraving ball or the engraving block. Has a base to it that you can mount on your bench, an adjustable hinge area through here, and then this is adjustable to the head of it. It has holes in it that you can put pegs in, and then you can adjust the in and out of it to hold your piece in position. I like to use the THERMO-LOC on the top of this, and it makes a really nice holder to hold my pieces in to set the stones. Let's put our stone in here and we'll be ready to set. Step 7 is setting the bezel. Don't be in a hurry to get that bezel wire pushed over the stone. Be patient here. You're going to be pushing it from one side and then going over to the other side and pushing a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here, and then be going back and forth over the stone and not starting on one spot and pushing the bezel all the way around, because you'll have excess metal at the end and you have a big blob and a big wrinkle there. I like to use the rocker or the pusher here, and we'll start on the one side, and I want to just kind of rock that down just a little tiny bit, turn my stone around, push down a little bit more, kind of right at the top edge here. Then we'll work at the other quarter. Rock that down just a little tiny bit. Go to the opposite side. And then push that down. Now that will start seating the stone in position and holding it for you. So let's go a little bit more here, in between the quarters. Jump over to the other side. Rock that down a little bit. Don't go all the way, just a little bit at a time. Jump over to the other side and push it down. And you can see that it's in there nice and tight, but we're not finished yet. I don't want to take up all your time, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to be going back and forth and rocking the bezel wire down against the stone, taking it a little bit at a time. Once that you have the bezel pushed down with the rocker, I like to take the burnisher over the entire upper surface of it and pushing down against the stone. So you're coming a little bit more from the top and rubbing that edge down, and it pushes it down against the stone and it polishes that very edge. And it just really makes it look gorgeous. Burnisher is a great tool. It's very, very handy. So I go around the entire surface of the bezel and push that upper edge down, and that will just seat that stone in there just gorgeous. Here's our finished piece, and you can see that the top edge of that bezel is real nice and smooth. We took our time going back and forth over the bezel wire, rocking it down, and then taking the burnisher over it at the very end, smoothing it down just super smooth. I hope that you've learned something from this video on bezel setting cabochon stones. Seems like it's real complicated, but if you just break it down in those basic steps, it's very easy. The biggest thing is be patient. Don't try to rush it. Take your time and you'll be very successful. Thanks for watching. I'm Greg Greenwood, and I'll see you next time.